This lecture is entitled Absolutism in Western Europe, circa or round about 1589 to 1715. Between 1589 and 1715 in Western Europe, two basic forms of government began to emerge. These two forms of government were constitutionalism, the focus of another lecture, and absolutism, the focus of this lecture. Absolutism can be defined in the following way. In an absolutist state, all power is held by a king who feels responsible only to God for his actions. In an absolutist state, there is rule by royal decree, not law. The king makes and breaks laws as he sees fit. No one keeps the power of the king in check or in balance. Not the people, not the people's representatives. In an absolutist state, absolute power is held by the leader. In the period 1589 to 1715, two countries emerged as absolutist states, France and Spain. It is true in this period that Great Britain also was an absolutist state, but we're going to focus on Great Britain in our lecture on constitutionalism because in 1689, Great Britain moved away from absolutism to constitutionalism. So for the focus of this lecture on absolutism, we'll be talking about France and Spain. The definition of absolutism, as we said a moment ago, is that in an absolutist state, all power is held by the king, who feels only responsible to God for his actions. That may not give you a good sense of what life was like in an absolutist state, so I'm going to describe for you 6 defining characteristics of absolutism. In an absolutist state, the nobility, those are the rich and powerful landowners, cooperate with the king or monarch. This is a relationship based on necessity. To keep their privileged status, their large land holdings, and their tax exemptions, nobles had to cooperate with an absolute monarch and stay on his good side. A monarch often cooperated with nobility, though he always reminded them that he was their superior. He would often cooperate with them to get money from this group of people for various projects. In an absolutist state, there is also regulation of religion. There is no religious freedom. The religion of the leader is the religion of the people. In an absolutist state, bureaucracies are established. These bureaucracies are staffed by royal career officials who are appointed by the king or one of his designees, and these royal career officials hold their positions until either they die or the king dies or they lose his favor. This is a position that is held for a lifetime, in other words, and a royal career official was always directly responsible to the king. In an absolutist state between 1589 and 1715, permanent standing armies were created. These were armies that were always trained, equipped, in uniform, and ready to go, whether it was peacetime or war. Last characteristic of an absolutist state, exaltation of the monarch and belief in divine right of the king. Kings who ruled absolutely in this period claimed that their family and they themselves had been selected by God for the position of king. And since they had been selected by God, this gave them more power than someone who was chosen based on hereditary status. In other words, claiming that they had been chosen by God gave them even more power and influence over the lives of people. So much so that people living in an absolutist state often exalted, praised, or worshipped their leader, recognizing him as second only to God in power and influence in their lives. In the country of France, Absolutism began during the reign of King Henry IV, who reigned from 1589 until his death by assassination in 1610. King Henry IV became King of France in 1589 by winning a religious civil war in France between Protestants and Catholics called the War of the Three Henrys. In 1589, Henry was the only Henry of the three fighting in the War of the Three Henrys who was left alive. So he won by simply surviving this war. It is not necessary for you to know all about the War of the Three Henrys. That is the stuff of Western Civilization 1. You can refer to your text if you would like to know more about the War of the Three Henrys. In 1589, King Henry IV began his reign with the selection of a minister or a chief advisor by the name Duke of Sully. The Duke of Sully and King Henry IV worked hard to stabilize France. Henry is often described as loving and caring for his people because he issued in 1598 the Edict of Nantes, which guaranteed religious freedom to the people and attempted to stop religious persecutions by Catholics and Protestants. He's also considered to have cared for his people because he kept taxes at a low and stable level for most individuals. It is true that the Duke of Sully envisioned raising tax money for Henry IV through highways which would increase revenue in the country by requiring people to pay tolls to use them and stimulating commerce and trade with easier access to and from various locations in France on these highways. They also came up with a tax called the paulette, which was a tax on any rich person in France who had literally bought, a political or government office rather than having earned this office based on merit or ability. This had been quite common in France before the reign of King Henry IV, that a rich person who simply desired to be mayor of Paris, for example, could pay a specified figure of several thousand francs and receive the office as well as a tax exemption. So it's true that most people in France in the noble class at this time were tax exempt. Well, at this time, in need of money, Henry IV and Duke of Sully determined that a new tax was in order called the paulette. This was a tax on any rich, noble person in France who had bought or inherited an office from a family member. This was an attempt by the French government to gain more revenue. After all, taxing the poor people was not especially successful. In France, as I mentioned before, most nobles were tax exempt, as were members of the middle class. Therefore, the tax burden was falling harshly and unfairly on the lower class people. The paulette was an effective tax and brought in a great deal of revenue for King Henry IV, and this resulted in the title of financial genius being applied to the Duke of Sully. When Henry IV died in 1610, he was succeeded by King Louis XIII, who reigned from 1610 to 1643. King Louis XIII had as his minister or chief advisor the Cardinal Richelieu, who is described in French history as an administrative genius because he extended royal authority, divided France into 32 generalities, it's called, and supported a newly created organization called the French Academy, which had as their major task the creation of a dictionary for the French language. Louis XIII was often absent from the capital, Paris, because he disliked Paris. He did not like the noise, the crowds, and he also didn't like the fact that his wife was in Paris. So he moved to the countryside, left Cardinal Richelieu to handle the matters of state, while he, Louis XIII, built for himself what he called, quote-unquote, a little hunting cabin. This little hunting cabin is known to the rest of the world as the Palace of Versailles, which stretches for more than 1/4 mile and has over 1,000 rooms inside it. This calling of the Palace of Versailles a little hunting cabin by Louis XIII really does show the extent of wealth of these French kings in the period, but also how they have no touch or no sense, really, of what the average, everyday, common person's life was like in France. When Louis XIII died, he was succeeded by King Louis XIV, who reigned from 1643 till his death in 1715. Louis XIV's reign is 72 years long. That is the longest reign in European history. No ruler before or since has ruled as long as Louis XIV. He holds the record for the longest reign of any European monarch. He is considered to be the peak of absolutism in France. He was known as the Sun King because he liberally embellished everything he could in his Palace of Versailles with gold. Gold furniture, gold vases, gold everything. At one point, Louis XIV, in recognition of his power, boasted, quote-unquote, "I am France," and as a testament to his power, the people of Europe recognized that they were living in the age of Louis XIV. And it was said of Louis that when Louis sneezes, all of Europe catches a cold. That simply means that Louis's impact was felt all across Europe, and he was the style and trendsetter for the time. It was fashionable to do whatever Louis was doing, even if that was being sick. Louis XIV was too young initially to rule France, so the job of ruling France fell to Jules Mazarin, who is considered to be, though rather harshly stated, politically stupid when one considers that the two ministers who immediately preceded him, Richelieu and Sully, were called administrative genius and financial genius. Jules Mazarin was not quite as adept at the job of minister as had been his predecessors. Jules Mazarin took upon himself the role of raising money for the child king Louis XIV. He felt that this was his most important task, was to make money for Louis XIV. He did this by raising taxes on the poor people to such a high rate that the poor people revolted in a civil war that is known as the Fronde. The dates vary for the Fronde. Some started a little earlier or a little later, but we'll use 1648 to 1653 as the dates for the Fronde. The Fronde was a period of civil war in which the lower class or poor people of France fought against the high taxes of Jules Mazarin. When Louis XIV began to rule independently in 1661, his first action was to fire Jules Mazarin and never employ a minister again. He learned a very valuable lesson from the Fronde, that a minister was good for getting you in trouble and not much else, and that the French people were untrustworthy and rebellious, and the only way to deal with them was absolutely. So Louis XIV is known as the peak of absolutism in France, and let's face it, with a 72-year reign, he has a lot of time to get absolutism right. Louis XIV was a short man by our standards today, only about 5 feet 5 inches tall, but for the time, people considered him to be very tall and very attractive. Europeans at the time admittedly were quite short, so 5'5" was a good-sized man at the time, and people thought he was very attractive, decently educated. He knew a little Latin and a couple of other languages, but it's not really important. His education was lacking, to say the least. In comparison to the ideals from the Renaissance, Louis was not especially well educated. He knew some foreign languages. He knew about history a little bit, and he knew a little bit about geography, but what he really understood was playing the role of king, and everyone who knew Louis XIV said he was born to play the part of king. He was the consummate actor. His role, King of France. He was on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and what I mean by that is he never acted like anything other than the King of France. He constantly acted superior to other people to get them, of course, to believe he was superior, and he surrounded himself with a great deal of ritual. Since he was called the Sun King, the people of France made a big deal out of Louis's day-to-day activities. In the Palace of Versailles, where Louis lived full-time and made the seat of French government and the social center of France, each day was started with an elaborate ceremony and ritual. As the sun rose each morning, Louis rose, and as the planets revolved around the sun, everything in France and in European politics revolved around Louis. So the rising of Louis was associated with as much importance as the rising of the sun daily. Louis is often described as the imitated. He had such a fabulously rich lifestyle out at the Palace of Versailles that rich people around Europe wanted to imitate Louis and be like him. No one really got close. No one could really afford a palace like Versailles. Some tried to build their own. What people could imitate about Louis was his style of dress and his language. And we see in the time period of Louis's reign that rather than speaking Latin as a second language, well-educated, rich people around Europe began to speak French as their second language. Louis used the Palace of Versailles as a political and diplomatic tool. He required his nobles to spend part of the year at his palace so that basically they could be put in their place and see what wealth and extravagance he had, knowing that they could not begin to compare with what he had. Also, this was an advantage too because he used it as an opportunity to spy on them while they were staying in his palace. He also saw this as an opportunity for their estates to fall into disrepair. They may be required to live at the Palace of Versailles for 6 months. So when they returned home to take care of their own houses and palaces, of course, they had so much work to do for the 6 months that they had been absent that they didn't have time to worry about what Louis was doing back at the Palace of Versailles. He also invited foreign diplomats from all around Europe to come stay at his palace each year so that they too could be reminded of his importance and his wealth. Louis's policies included making France self-sufficient economically, religiously making everyone Catholic, and making for himself the largest military in Europe. Let's talk about each of these for a moment. In terms of economic affairs, Louis employed an advisor, never a minister, but an advisor on economic issues. This man was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert and Louis XIV desired to make France self-sufficient, that whatever French people needed, they should be able to buy or get within France from a French business. This policy was called mercantilism. Louis XIV and Colbert tried to make France self-sufficient, tried to export only and never import. They were able to do that for a short while, but mercantilism eventually failed. On the issue of religion, Louis XIV was a devout Catholic. Despite a divorce and several mistresses, he claimed to be extremely religious. Because he was extremely devout and loyal to the Catholic Church, he revoked his grandfather's Edict of Nantes in 1685, making Protestantism illegal in the country of France. In terms of the military, Louis XIV employed an advisor named Jean Martinet to help him transform his army. The army that Louis XIV inherited dated back to 1635 and had in it only 25,000 men. This is very small. Now, that was typical for Europe at the time, but Louis liked big, grand things, like his palace at Versailles, so he wanted a big, grand army also. He and Martinet worked to create an army that was the largest assembled in Europe at the time, 250,000 men. By 1659, Louis had 250,000 soldiers in his army. His army far exceeded any of the armies that were in Europe. His army was beyond what anyone else had in Europe. How did his army get so big so fast? Through drafts of able-bodied men in France, and also through a practice called dragooning, where recently drafted soldiers would literally go out and drag off the streets of Paris and other cities men who were drunk, who were homeless, or who were street criminals, and force them against their will into the army. So Louis's army grew through drafts and by forcing drunks, criminals, and homeless people off the street and straight into the army. Louis's army was huge, and he intended to use it, and he certainly did. Between 1667 and 1713, Louis was engaged in continual war. These wars are simply called the Wars of Louis XIV. What Louis desired was to add territories along his northern and eastern boundaries. These included places like Franche-Comté, which he gained from a treaty in 1678. He added a little bit of territory along his northern and eastern boundaries, and really, to be honest, the territory that he gained was not impressive at all, considering that it took him 33 years to gain these territories and that he had Europe's largest army. Louis was, during the majority of his reign, a very popular king, but towards the end of his life, he became increasingly unpopular with the people of France. They thought that he was wasting time, money, and a generation of young men on too little territory. And apparently this was something that weighed very heavily on Louis XIV, his ever-increasing unpopularity. When he died in 1715, those around him said that he had grown quite contemplative just before he died. In other words, he was thinking a lot about himself and his legacy. Supposedly, his dying words were, "I have gone to war too often for too little." He recognized that what the French people were saying was true, that what we see is true, that he wasted a lot of time and energy and a lot of young men on not much territory. The next area that we're going to look at as an example of absolutism is the country of Spain. And what I'm going to focus on in this lecture is the decline of absolutist Spain. In our previous lecture, we saw that Spain had a huge amount of territory in the Americas from conquest during the Age of Discovery. Spain had grown quite wealthy, quite powerful, and their empire didn't just exist in the Americas. They had a great deal of territory in Europe as well. The Spanish royal family at this time was called the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgs had under their control Spain, obviously, some parts of the Netherlands, and through carefully arranged marriages for political benefit only, not for romance or love, they controlled parts of the Holy Roman Empire as well. And that, of course, represents Germany and Italy. Areas we know today as Germany and Italy were called the Holy Roman Empire in this time period. So Spain had a huge amount of territory, but by the 1590s, they were in rapid decline. This was because they repeatedly engaged in wars that they could not afford and were suffering some economic problems. Spain had gone more or less from boom to bust as a result of their conquest in the Americas. what happens to Spain in this period is that initially the gold and silver that they take out of the Americas and bring to their economy makes them wealthy. But over time, they continue to import more and more gold and silver into their economy, and this led to inflation. There was a lot of money in circulation, but that means it's worth less. Over time, Spain eventually ended up in an economic depression, and if you want to see how all that played out, you can read about it in your textbook. But Spain experienced severe economic problems by the 1590s, and usually when a government finds itself struggling for cash or strapped for cash, they resort to taxing. The problem in Spain, however, was that there was no one to tax. Rich people in Spain were tax exempt just because they were rich. The poor people were too broke, and so Spain, unlike France, did not attempt to tax the poor people. So what about the middle class? Unfortunately, the middle class was non-existent in Spain, and this is due to Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand and Isabella had driven out during the Spanish Inquisition all of those who were not Catholic, namely Jews and Muslims, who made up the middle class. So without a middle class, Spain's economic problems grew worse. Add to this that they had extremely weak rulers at this time. And by weak, we mean ineffective, but also physically and mentally weak. You can only marry cousin to cousin for so long before it has really negative consequences. And some of the rulers of Spain, the late Habsburg dynasty, was riddled with problems from incestual relations from cousins marrying cousins, mental and physical retardation, in other words. This was the case of King Charles II of Spain. King Charles II reigned from 1665 to 1700 as the King of Spain. He had a host of mental and physical problems, incest caught up with the Habsburgs in Charles II. When Charles II died in 1700, he died heirless. His physical problems had prevented him from being able to, well, how should we say? It prevented him from having a child. King Charles II died without an heir, and this was a huge problem. Spain has a great deal of territory in the Americas and in Europe. Who's going to inherit it? Well, Charles II left his throne not to anyone in Spain, believe it or not. He actually left Spain to Louis XIV's grandson, a young man named Philip of Anjou. Why did he do this? Why would he leave all of Spanish territory to France? Because at one point, Louis XIV had been convinced to divorce his first wife for a Spanish woman. He was told, Louis XIV, that this Spanish woman was extremely attractive, and when she arrived in France to be his new bride, Louis was not happy with her appearance and had demanded payment and compensation for it. Well, since Spain was entering into this period of economic difficulties, they did not have the money to pay Louis XIV for the Spanish bride that he was unhappy with. Charles II was trying to make good on the problems between France and Spain by giving Spain and all of its territories and its problems to France. This immediately resulted in a war called the War of the Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1713. The War of the Spanish Succession was fought because Charles II did not have his own heir. He left the throne of Spain to a Frenchman. Around Europe, this terrified the countries. They were afraid that a unification between France and Spain was going to happen, that it was imminent, and that would upset the balance of power in Europe. So, fighting in the War of the Spanish Succession were France and Spain, who were fighting to put Philip of Anjou on the throne. They were fighting against the Grand Alliance, Great Britain, the Dutch Netherlands, Austria, and Prussia, who were fighting to ensure that Philip of Anjou did not gain the throne of France. Long war made short. In 1713, the Grand Alliance defeated France and Spain. One would suspect then that Philip of Anjou would not be the King of Spain. After all, the Grand Alliance was fighting against his acquisition of the Spanish throne. Yet, the Grand Alliance allows Philip of Anjou to be the king after all. So, what was the point of the war? Why fight? Well, what happened right at the end of the war was that Great Britain turned on its allies and negotiated an agreement with France and Spain. Great Britain, in exchange for allowing Philip of Anjou the throne of Spain, was given from France Newfoundland and Canada. That's part of the colony of Canada. France gives it over to Great Britain. Spain gave over the slave trade from Africa to the Americas to Great Britain. It was extremely profitable. That was the bribe to Great Britain. So at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, Philip of Anjou has the throne of Spain anyway. That is the end of the Habsburgs forever as the royal family of Spain. Instead, we now have on the throne a Frenchman from the Bourbon family. So French people now control Spain. This really does show that Spain has declined and is no longer a power. Louis XIV had to promise in the Peace of Utrecht, which ended the War of the Spanish Succession, that he would never unify France and Spain, and France and Spain never did. He made good on his promise. He never unified those two. He never took over or attempted to take over Spanish territories in the Americas. He stuck true to the treaty that he signed. Sometimes, after the defeat of the Spanish, historians call Spain quixotic. This is a word that we have borrowed from a Spanish masterpiece of this time period by Miguel Cervantes called Don Quixote. If anyone has read the book Don Quixote, what they take away from it is that Don Quixote was a troubled man. Don Quixote is symbolic of Spain. Miguel Cervantes wrote this book to show Spain's problems. In the book, Don Quixote envisions himself as a great power, as a great individual with wonderful ideas and tons of talent and ability and money and prestige and influence. So to say that Spain was quixotic, a word taken from Quixote, what we're saying is Spain, like the title character Don Quixote, was sort of lost in the clouds or had their head in the clouds. They thought they were very well-to-do, rich, powerful, at the top of their game, so to speak, when in actuality this was not the case at all. The Spanish, like Don Quixote, were deluded. The word quixotic literally means idealistic but impractical, full of grand notions, not based in reality. If one had asked the Spanish people after the War of the Spanish Succession, how is Spain doing? The Spanish people would have said, great. We're doing wonderful. We're rich. We're powerful. We have the respect of Europe, and that simply was not true. Everyone knew that Spain was weak, suffering economic problems, in a state of decline, so much so that their ruling family, the Habsburgs, had ceased to exist. They died out with Charles II. They were now, in fact, under the control of a Frenchman, Philip of Anjou. That ends this lecture.